Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for giving me up your precious time today. Recently, we've been listening to our customers' feedback about what keeps them awake at night, the threats they are facing, and the kind of questions they are being asked by their management. Cybersecurity is a funny old thing. It's continually in the news, always for the wrong reasons, which means, unfortunately, everyone has an opinion on it. There are instant experts about what you, as a professional, need to do to keep your systems, data, colleagues, ultimately safe and secure. Hopefully by the end of the session today, you'll have a clearer idea what the problems are and what is available to you as an NHS organisation to ensure that you are one step ahead of the threat actors. So without further ado, let's have a look at the sort of things we are going to discuss today. So we'll start with some introductions of this morning's presentation panel before moving on to a fundamentally critical point. Why are you guys on this call today within the NHS so vulnerable? You don't generate any revenue, so why are you so high up on the victim target list for these threat actors? We'll then take a closer look at the cybersecurity obligations that you have as an NHS organisation before looking at the really good stuff. And what I mean by that is the tools that you have at your fingertips and disposal in order to stay one step ahead, because that's what it's all about. As you know, the threat landscape is constantly changing and evolving, but unless you have the fundamentals in place and a process for refinement and improvement, then you may well be seen as a weak link. And then towards the end of the session, we'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. And when it comes to these, you essentially have two options. If you want to remain anonymous, please send me an email to wgib@ansecurity.com, or feel free to drop a question in the Q&A section of the Zoom console. So who's joining me on the presentation panel today? Well, for those who don't already know me on the call, I am Will Gibb, and I'm the account lead here at ANSecurity for the healthcare sector. I have many years experience within the sector, and it's pretty much everything I do, from helping NHS organisations to make the right investments to improving the overall security posture for the lowest total cost of ownership possible. I'm also joined today by my colleague James Preston, who I believe some of you had the pleasure of working with previously, but for those who don't already know James, I'll let him take this opportunity to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Will. So I'm James Preston. I have been working with ANSecurity a little under 2 years now, and predominantly in the healthcare space, working with the Cyber Essentials program, so getting people compliant there, and equally so looking to do security audits around their Palo Alto firewalls or any other next generation firewall platforms they might have. Thank you very much, Will.
Thanks, James. So the bad news for the NHS is that unfortunately you're seen as a real target. But the good news is there are lots of things available to you in order to mitigate these risks. However, to ensure that you're ready for this challenge, we need to first understand the problem, i.e. the more you understand about your enemy, the higher chance you have of beating them. And the reality is we need to win every single battle, whereas the enemy only needs to win that one time. I've intentionally tried to make this session as educational as possible, and hopefully there shouldn't be any sniff of a sales pitch. At ANSecurity, we are fiercely proud of the fact that we're independent. For us, it's about understanding the problem and then providing the right advice based upon those individual circumstances, irrespective of whether it may be financially beneficial for us or not. In the same vein, we feel it's really important to ensure when it comes to facts and statistics that are laid bare by technology vendors, that most instances you should treat them with a pinch of salt, as they will come with a level of bias. We always look for independent studies in order to help build a complete picture of what's going on in the cyber world. I have to say that one of the best studies I've come across last year on the UK health sector was by the Imperial College London late last year. This was pre-COVID-19, but pretty much everything that was written and covered is relevant in this new world. You can of course access the full report online, but if you do want me to send a copy, please do drop me a note. So what does the report actually say? Now, I'm pretty certain that everyone on this call will agree with the infographic in front of you. Cybersecurity is rarely given the investment priority it needs. Hospitals are measured on clinical outcomes, not the number of breaches stopped. However, the reality is that increasingly large numbers of clinical systems have some sort of internet gateway, which means they have a threat surface that needs to be managed securely. And failure to do this not only impacts on clinical outcomes, but it also impacts on bottom line financial performance and the impact to reputation. The report also cites there's a chronic underinvestment in cybersecurity within the UK health economy when compared to other market sectors. Limited budgets also force you to make difficult choices, and threat attackers are 100% aware of this. The second key learning is around company staff. The first challenge you are faced with is probably recruitment. Hiring cybersecurity staff is incredibly difficult and testing for the NHS, and a recent Freedom of Information request showed that 25% of NHS trusts had absolutely no employees with any cybersecurity qualifications. The second challenge is the rank and file of non-IT staff. Now, it's a common cliche that email is the #1 threat vector with any organisation, with around 96% of threats emanating from email. Now, there are a number of characteristics which make hospitals a very attractive target. This could include the sheer number of employees who may not even have cybersecurity at the top of their to-do list. Potential data loss is also seen by the report as being a challenge. Like any business, the NHS may have disgruntled employees. The difference here is the data they have access to on a day-to-day basis, which would have significant value to either the criminally or maliciously minded. The final challenge is the transient nature of the workforce. For example, if your staff are consisting of numerous agency and temporary staff, then you have a greater increase in your organizational threat vector due to the understanding of systems and the inherent challenges of tracking and monitoring access and the use of these systems. These are all simple metrics which the threat actors can measure. For them, it becomes a simple numbers game. We're having a professional-like mindset where they'll focus all their efforts on those areas where they're going to have the greatest likelihood of success. Third key learning is what you can see in front of you is around infrastructure and devices. And I personally have touched upon this in the points I made earlier regarding the lack of investment. However, Imperial College London had some serious considerations which were much more concerning than just pound notes. Clearly, the NHS has grown organically, and there are a number of different networks such as HSCN and PSCN and direct internet connections which require differing security approaches. You put this all together, and a threat actor would view this inconsistent IT landscape as a potential treasure trove. As a sector, it makes both clinical and commercial sense for NHS organisations to follow NHS Digital and indeed wider Cabinet Office guidelines to actively widen access and open up these systems, whilst at the same time creating a great range and depth of data in the process. Again, this could create the perfect storm. And finally, history to date has shown that response capabilities are inefficient and can be costly due to the factors we have spoken about. Complicated interrelationships and hierarchical governance structures prevent the NHS from responding to cyber attacks in a fast and agile way. So what happens when it does all go wrong? Now, I think you need to be living in a cave not to be aware of 2017 and WannaCry, so I'm not going to waste your time explaining it too much. Let's just say it was the biggest cyber attack on NHS networks in history, affecting over 600 organisations and causing nearly 20,000 appointments to be cancelled. But what was the cost? Now, if you've researched or Googled the information, you'll see a value of £92 million mentioned. However, the reality is we just do not know the true cost of WannaCry, and this was confirmed by the National Audit Office in the summary findings of their inquest, which in itself is very concerning. So we've looked at all the bad news. Let's have a look at some of the positives. As an NHS organisation, there's been significant investment by the Department of Health and NHS Digital in the frameworks, the tools available, and user education to ensure that you have lots of resources available to reduce the likelihood of becoming the next victim. However, with all these tools comes some level of obligation. So I just want to take a few moments to go through a few of these with you and just to understand what you have access to, but also what you are obliged to do. So the first framework I'd like to talk about is something that everyone on this call should be hopefully aware of, Cyber Essentials accreditation. Now, here at ANSecurity, we are huge advocates of Cyber Essentials because if you deploy the 5 technical controls that are required in order to achieve CE+, then you reduce your organizational threat risk by at least 80%. We have run numerous sessions on CE+, and James, like all our consultants, who helps NHS Trusts to prepare for the Plus standard, is happy to provide more detailed information. So if you'd like to organise a separate session, please do let me know. It's a government-backed information assurance scheme, which is run out of the NCSC, and it shows you how to address the basics and prevent the most known common attacks. It comes in 2 simple flavours, if you like. The first being a self-assessment. The second requiring an on-site audit and the cost depending on the size of the business. Now, this is not just a simple fire and forget exercise, it's about implementing long-lasting security posture improvements. You all know, no doubt be aware, the NCSC has mandated that all NHS organisations have to develop plans to achieve compliance with CE+ by June 2021. And currently, there is no reason to believe the current COVID crisis will impact this deadline. Now, the cynics amongst you looking at this presentation were thinking, well, of course the government's going to enforce the adoption of its own standards, but it really is not the case with Cyber Essentials, as the evidence is why should we do this is right in front of us. However, and I really need to stress this point, if you implement the 5 technical controls consistently, in other words, the basics to a high standard every single time, then you will reduce your organizational cybersecurity threat risk by at least 80%. The second tool I'd like to talk to you today is about the DSP Toolkit. Now, despite mandating that NHS organisations need to achieve Cyber Essentials Plus, it's been stepped up a gear and creation of the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, or the DSPT for short. So irrespective of what your sector you operate in, the majority of our ANSecurity customers will start to look at the SIS controls framework once they have achieved Cyber Essentials Plus and start to embed some of those new working practices into their day-to-day lives. And this is basically what NHS Digital have done with the DSPT Toolkit. In its very most simplistic form, you can view it as an NHS interpretation of the relevant SIS control framework. This is of course required for all organisations who have access to NHS patient data and systems. You'll be required to complete the toolkit, which is not an insignificant amount of work, and by way of guidance, there are 166 mandatory evidence items that will be required to be reviewed and collated. The submission window for the DSPT starts next month on the 30th of September, so the clock is ticking here. And if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you to start thinking about this now. We get involved in sector-specific accreditation in a number of regulated markets, such as financial services. And unfortunately, the effort that's required for DSPT probably tops the lot. Please do not make the mistake of thinking you can just rock up and start approaching the DSPT. It requires an organised and considered approach. So it can be quite complicated or require high levels of organisation. And one of the key reasons being that outsourced services are included within the scope. And what I mean by this is where services are outsourced, for example, by use of cloud or cloud infrastructure services, you need to understand and accurately record which security related responsibilities remain with you and which are the suppliers. So this has an impact right across the board, all the way from procurement through the supply chain. So ask yourself this question. Right now, can each of your suppliers provide this guarantee? I'd be extremely confident in guessing this may not be the case. We talked earlier about the reasons why NHS organisations were so susceptible to cyber threats. And one of the key points from the Imperial College report was related to the transient nature of the workforce and the implications it had with ongoing training. Well, the good news here is that it's being picked up. As part of the DSP, 95% of all staff, that includes new starters, temporary staff, students, contractors to work in the business, will have to complete an annual data security awareness training and pass it as a mandatory test. Now, as you can understand logistically, this can provide its own challenges. However, it is essential in order to force the culture change that the healthcare sector urgently requires. But let's remind ourselves, why are we going through this? What is the point of all this effort, time, resource, and cost? Well, the absolutely excellent news is that it reduces your cybersecurity threat risk even further. As I said earlier, if you build into your day-to-day operations the 5 technical controls of Cyber Essentials Plus, then you're going to reduce your threat risk by around 80%. But this still leaves a significant level of risk. However, once you've gone that step further and achieved the DSPT accreditation, then that 80% increases to over 90%. For the moment, that's everything from me. I'm now going to hand over to James, who's going to talk to you about the Secure Boundary Service. James.
Thank you, Will. So the Secure Boundary Service it's one of the new services which the NHS are offering as a free at point of use. So this is free for NHS trusts and commissioning support units, the CSUs. And the idea of the Secure Boundary Service is they want to provide a centralized service which is going to help you protect your data, ensure that threat actors can't actually get at it through the boundary itself. Now, as well as being designed to protect you against known threats, there's a key focus on emerging threats, those threats which have never been seen before. And we'll have a specific look at a couple of the protections provided a little bit later in the presentation. Now, Will has talked at great length there about the DSPT and also the Cyber Essentials Plus frameworks. And the great thing is, by adopting the secure boundary, you do actually get a couple of boxes pre-ticked for you. You still need to do a little bit of work, of course, to ensure that your rules are appropriate, but you do get those extra boxes ticked if you're not already meeting those requirements. Now, there are two services delivered through the Secure Boundary. The one that we're going to focus on specifically today is the perimeter and next generation firewall aspect. So this is protecting your internal users from the threats that they might come across out on the internet. The web application firewall service being something different. This is looking at protecting services which you might be publishing to the internet from the threats that are found on the internet itself. Those are looking to perhaps exploit vulnerabilities in those. These might encompass web applications like your patient prescription services if you're publishing one of those, and equally so just your plain old public-facing websites as well. So as far as how this actually aligns to DSPT requirements, so like I said, you get a couple of these boxes ticked immediately for you. So by having the secure boundary, you will have a suitable perimeter security device. Now, of course, this is going to apply to pretty much all organizations already. But one of the great things about the platform that they're actually delivering the secure boundary through with the Palo Alto Network's next generation security platform is it really is a top-notch, top right of Gartner perimeter security service. It delivers a wide range of protections that we can look at. Going down this list in no particular order, of course, we've got proxy servers. Are you using some form of a service to protect your clients from web-based threats? And again, we'll have a look at how the secure boundary service ticks this box a little bit later in the presentation. But of course, you're not entirely off the hook. You still have other requirements which are not simple box ticking exercises where you still need to put some time, energy and effort in, of course, to meet those requirements. In particular, this is around ensuring that you have rules which have a valid business justification in your firewall, ensuring that these rules are not just documented in the firewall itself, but also approved by someone inside your organization at the appropriate level. One of the important things to understand as well is that once that business justification no longer exists, perhaps you've been allowing access to a particular service for some time, but that service is no longer required, that you do also then identify those rules and disable or ultimately remove them. Now, the Palo Alto Network Security Platform is all about application control at the very core. When their very first kind of version 1 firewalls were released, it was about not just protecting yourself from threats that might come from web-borne aspects, but also other applications, other services that you can publish or access. And what we typically do is group applications out into 3 main categories. So those which are sanctioned, those which are tolerated, and those which are unsanctioned, and apply appropriate security controls to each of them. So in that sanctioned category, we might see things like Microsoft Office 365 or the NHS mail service, of course. And for these, we can safely enable them, but also apply appropriate security measures like decrypting the traffic and inspecting it to perhaps see if mail is being used as a method of delivering malware. You then move over to the right with tolerated applications. So these are the ones which you might not have a specific requirement for inside the organization, but to cut them off would be detrimental to your users. One of the examples that we might use here, of course, is services like Netflix, perhaps being used by patients over patient-delivered Wi-Fi. It's not specifically required for the operation of the business, but it is a handy service to have published out there or to be able to access. And just as we do with the sanctioned applications, we can enforce security policies on these other services to ensure that they're only being used for legitimate purposes and then they're not being used to hide possible threats. We then come over to the far right with unsanctioned applications. And the typical ones we see here, of course, in an NHS setting is file transfer services, so tools like Dropbox or even just plain old FTP creeping into this category as applications that we just want to outright block. The great thing is about the secure boundary, it is designed to make these rules really easy to apply out to your infrastructure. Coming around to that visibility aspect, so you can dive into the secure boundary services, logs and reporting information, and kick out these web-based reports and equally so PDF reports to give you some insights as to what's actually happening inside your network. One of the little aspects of that kind of block diagram at the top left-hand corner there is assigning each application a measure of risk. So for example, RapidShare is being highlighted as a high-level risk, whilst BitTorrent and SMTP, both being services which are very easy to transfer malware and other vulnerabilities, as critical level risks in the deep maroon red there. And equally so, you can write rules such that these applications, which are typically being used in a malicious manner, in particular kind of your BitTorrent, for example, and ensuring they are indeed blocked over your network. When it comes to the PDF reporting aspects, one of the really handy ones that we see all too often is highlighting which SaaS applications are in use inside your organization. And of course, the notion of shadow IT isn't going anywhere anytime soon. You'll have those applications which have a legitimate business need that have been procured centrally, whilst you might find that your users are continuing to use other applications which might not be entirely authorized by the business. And of course, this SaaS application usage report can highlight those to you very quickly and very easily. In this case, identifying services like SurveyMonkey, Jive, and Evernote being used. Now with these SaaS applications, it then drills down into perhaps if they've got characteristics which are not particularly useful or particularly sanctioned. So those applications which have had recent data breaches, those which might have poor terms of service, where if you upload files to that service, the service owner then owns the data. And what we see organizations actually using this database for is informing their business decisions. They can look up in the database, perhaps they're looking to use a new file transferring service. Has it had poor terms of service? Has it has no data breaches in the past, for example? And equally so, when we're writing our rules, we can use characteristics and categories to, again, safely enable those applications that we do want and ensure that those applications which we don't are blocked. In particular there on the left-hand side, we've got software update highlighted. So we don't want to go through and necessarily identify every single update application inside our environment. So we can safely enable the category and then applying security best practices to that as well through the rule set. But equally so, characteristics such as those applications which have known vulnerabilities, those applications which are prone to misuse, we can again write rules such that these applications are not permitted anywhere on our network. And coming back round to the SaaS side of things as well, there's a number of characteristics which can be, again, matched inside rules. Perhaps if you're working with financial data, you want to only enable those applications which have PCI DSS requirements against them. And equally so, if you're looking for secure hosting of information, the SOC 2 standard is a very easy one to use there. And as Will kind of alluded to earlier, don't just use the Cyber Essentials and the DSPT against your own organizations. If you are buying in other services, ask them to prove that they've got Cyber Essentials plus at a minimum, and of course enforce upon them the requirements for DSPT if it's relevant. One of the other core aspects of the secure boundary service is enabling organizations to have decryption for those relevant services. All too often we're going to NHS trusts and organisations of all sizes that perhaps have somewhat undersized their firewalls and don't have the ability to easily enable the decryption of traffic through that firewall. Brilliant thing about the secure boundary is it has that built in from the get-go, as it were. Now, of course, there are going to be some categories that we don't want to apply decryption to, healthcare, of course, being at the top of that list, but government and banking reaching into it as well for not just ethical and moral, but also legal requirements as well. Whilst those websites and web services and those other applications that might traverse the firewall, which are perhaps using unsigned certificates or have expired certificates, or perhaps even are still using TLS 1.0 or 1.1, can have their access cut off entirely and blocked at the level of the firewall. One of the innovative uses that we've seen of the firewalls in the past actually is identifying those applications which are using TLS 1.0 and 1.1 and getting back to the vendors and saying, hey guys, when are we going to be enabling TLS 1.2? What are you doing to meet emerging and required security standards? Whilst all other traffic can then be decrypted and inspected to see if there is indeed malicious payloads inside there or any other threats that might be hiding. Now, I mentioned earlier that the secure boundary is all about protecting not just against known threats, but also those emerging threats. And one of the aspects about that is the wildfire service. Now, wildfire is a sandboxing tool which can spin up all types of files from your plain old executables and binaries to your Word documents, archives, and even web URL links as well. The notion being that when that application, when that binary, when that document is spun up inside the sandbox, that if it's seen attempting to do something malicious, perhaps interact with the system in a non-standard way or reaching out to a known command and control server, that can be detected, the administrator informed, and policy enforced upon that client, perhaps to cut it off from the internet entirely. The next service, again, meeting the requirements of Cyber Essentials and the DSPT, is in having some element of URL filtering, have some kind of proxy between your users and the internet. And for the longest time, URL filtering has been kind of viewed as a bit draconian, so being used to perhaps block adult content or the access to social media, all things which we can reliably expect users to not be using during working hours these days. But the reality is that URL filtering now is a powerful tool that can block access to websites that perhaps have been seen delivering malware, or perhaps those which have been seen attempting to exploit phishing scams, for example, as well. Now, through the secure boundary, you're not just getting the firewalls, you are getting all the trimmings as well. That includes the MindMeld service, which is a tool which allows the NHS centrally to aggregate information from multiple feeds. And these feeds might have lists of known malicious IP addresses. They might have lists of known malicious signatures. To then take those, aggregate them, filter them, sort them, and inject them into the firewalls such that, again, rules can be built to block access to these malicious services. And they can also be used for the inverse as well. So perhaps identifying those applications which do need to have firewall access, in particular those going out to NHS Mail and Office 365 as well. And when it comes to management, if you've got multiple of the secure boundary instances throughout your environment, centralized management is delivered through a service called Panorama. And again, this is a web-based service which allows you to manage all of your firewalls regardless of where they are. Now, it doesn't just stop there. Relatively newly introduced to the secure boundary as of May 2020 is the National Cybersecurity Centre's PDNS, or Protective DNS service. And this is all about blocking malicious traffic at the DNS level. And this is looking for domains which have perhaps been seen, again, hosting malware or viruses in the past, and blocking those from ever reaching your clients in the first place, blocking them at the very highest level of protection possible. Now, this is already in use by central government, and it's actually been mandated for use throughout government services. And it also includes an element of logging as well, such that if one of your clients does indeed visit one of the sites which has been flagged by the PDNS service as being malicious, not only does the user get an alert, a warning that something bad has happened, but also that you as the administrators can go and examine the logs and identify what was going on at that point in time. So the reality is that the secure boundary is not just good for you, but it's also good for the wider NHS as well. So the logging through the secure boundary service is centralized into what's known as the Cortex data lake. This is, again, another cloud-hosted service which stores all the log information, all the traffic which is traversing through the firewall. Now, that log information is stored for a period of 6 months. And the brilliant thing there is that most threat actors will potentially go hiding inside a network for 200 plus days. And by having this rich amount of information stored for a very sensible period of time, if we do have a breach, if we do have a compromise, we've actually got that information to go back and examine what happened. All too often, organizations have a breach and there is no way for us to tell what truly happened just because the logs don't exist. And that simply isn't true with the secure boundary service. Now, as all this log information is being stored, aggregated, filtered, and inspected, of course, it allows the NHS's Cybersecurity Operations Centre to have an element of centralised threat intelligence. Just as they do already with the Defender ATP, they can go and examine the information on a national scale and again, put new rules in, put new block lists in if a particular threat is highlighted, allowing them to kind of break down those barriers to blocking threats. Which are caused by the delays and latencies in existing services, and have real meaningful impact at a very rapid speed. So secure boundary service, it's going to sound great. Even if you already have a next generation firewall, it is well worth investigating for adoption. So what to do next? Of course, if you search NHS Secure Boundary, you're going to come across this website. If you can't find it, just let Will or your account manager know, and they can email over this link for you. Effectively, you go to the site, there's a little bit more information available for you. The NHS themselves are running webinars as well on the tools and services that are available. And if you are then keen to sign up for it, get in touch with their email address provided, and they'll take you through the onboarding process. What we would of course say as well, that if you are interested in getting on board with the Secure Boundary, get in touch with your ANSecurity account manager, and we can provide any assistance that you might need in migrating the services as required. So all this sounds absolutely brilliant, but the reality is not all the threats are going to be stopped by the Secure Boundary. It is by its pure nature just a boundary service, something that's protecting you from the internet. But what about the threats that make it already inside your network? So this chappie called David Bianco came out with the notion of the pyramid of pain back in 2013. And the idea is at each tier, if we take away one of these aspects for the threat actors, how much effort do they have to go through? How much pain do they have to go through to reorientate their attack or to overcome the limitations that you've imposed? So hash values, for example, if we identify a new malicious payload and we've got its hash value, we can then go and put that inside our firewalls or AV engines and block those from executing in the future. But the reality is, of course, for threat actors that it is very, very easy, in fact, trivial for them to change hash values of their malicious payloads. And equally so, if we take away an IP address or a domain name that's been seen using the ability to deliver malware, again, it's relatively easy for a threat actor to get hold of a new IP address or a new domain name and again, resume their assault. Whereas if we can go all the way up to the top and take away the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs that threat actors use to actually get inside networks, move laterally, and take the data out that they're interested in, it can make it really tough for the threat actors to actually maintain persistence, make it really tough for them to actually carry out their malicious work. So this then takes us into an organization called MITRE. So this is a not-for-profit research organization out in the United States. And they've come up with the MITRE attack framework. And this is all about identifying these TTPs, identifying these ways for threat actors to actually get inside your network. And if the only thing that you take away from this presentation is that you head over to GitHub and search for the attack navigator, and that you identify how much coverage have we actually got from this, I think we could call this presentation successful. Now, what we've got here is an overview as to how much protection we get from the Secure Boundary alone. And you can see that we've got plenty of coverage there over in initial access and in particular in command and control as well. The Secure Boundary, if the threat actors are looking to use these TTPs, will help block those threat actors. But the reality is we've got a lot of gaps there, in particular in lateral movement. And by embedding one of these next generation firewall platforms inside your network and not just at the boundary, we can enhance our coverage. We can go from the 80% coverage that we get with Cyber Essentials to the 90% of coverage that we get through the DSPT, up to much higher values just by expanding our ability to protect our network and by embedding firewalls inside our environments. Now, if we were to take a couple of examples here, so starting out with what's called a trusted relationship. So perhaps you've got organizations which you provide access to your VPN, perhaps they deliver software updates to you, or perhaps they have their own support tools running as a service inside your environment. What happens if that trusted relationship gets compromised? Well, effectively, they're already inside your network. You've granted them access. So the secure boundary isn't going to help us here. What we need to do is look for other methods of blocking the threat actors that might look to exploit trusted relationships. And the reality is only a couple of years ago that a Ukrainian software developer that handled financial information, that developed software to manage banking in particular, was breached, and their software update tool was compromised by the threat actors. And the threat actors there, in a very sophisticated attack, then actually used their software update mechanisms to spread their malware throughout any site that was using that particular software. And equally so, we've seen third parties, again, who perhaps haven't taken their data security obligations as seriously as they should be, again, getting breached. And it just takes a threat actor to realize that they've got a VPN connection inside an NHS trust for them to start moving laterally, for them to start stealing data, perhaps through this trusted relationship that you've got. So one of the brilliant things about the MITRE attack tactics is it identifies the mitigations for each of these issues as well. And again, have a look at the attack navigator, see how much coverage you've got, and start right-clicking and looking at the tactics and the tactics that the threat actors actually go through. And this will give you the mitigations. So one of those mitigations, and the top one of our list here, is network segmentation. As I've said already, by embedding that firewall into the center of your network, by inspecting traffic that's not just traversing between you and the internet, but also traffic that's going between your VPN zone and any other network zone as well, we can block these threat actors, or at least limit the scope of their ability to do damage. The same applies to other mitigations as well. So having software update managements in control, inspecting software updates for malicious payloads before you actually go and apply them out to your computers, and equally so having elements of user account control, perhaps enabling only remote access during working hours, the times that we would normally expect to see these trusted relationships using their VPNs or other tools. Our second example, using remote services and exploiting remote services. So again, envision a situation where our threat actor has already made it inside the network. Perhaps it's a simple case of they've plugged into your guest Wi-Fi, and maybe the guest Wi-Fi isn't suitably isolated, or even in some cases with the very frequent nature of people coming and going from a hospital, that they've just found an empty network port and plugged their laptop inside there, depending, of course, of the skill level and the risks that the threat actors want to take. And the things that they're going to be looking for are remote desktop servers. They're going to be looking for SMB shares. And both of these have had recent vulnerabilities against them. Both of these have had recent ways to exploit them. Of course, harking back to WannaCry, and one day as IT security professionals, we'll stop talking about WannaCry, but for the time being, it's still the one that we're going to be focusing on, exploiting old SMB version 1. But we've also seen recently vulnerabilities in the Microsoft print spooler or even just DHCP servers. And equally so, if you've got some form of software development going on in-house, the CIDC platforms that they can be using, like Jenkins, for example, could be exploited. Now, again, to mitigate these, the MITRE attack navigator gives you the options. It gives you the ways to stop these threats. And one of the ones that we're going to hark out again, of course, is having an element of network segmentation and segregation, only enabling access to these services from trusted network zones. You know, there is no general need, perhaps, for remote desktop protocol to be enabled from your client computers to your servers, but perhaps there is from your administrators to your servers. So it really boils down to the need to protect not just traffic going to and from the internet, but also traffic that's traversing inside your network. And here, the same tools that are used to deliver the secure boundary through the Palo Alto Networks security platform can be used as well. Be that in their hardware appliances, their virtual machine series, either deployed on premise or in the cloud. And equally so, if you're one of those trusts that is really pioneering, modern computing, perhaps using Docker or Kubernetes to deliver services, there's also now the containerized version of the firewall as well. So what are 3 calls to action? What are the 3 things that, if at the very least we don't take away the MITRE attack navigator, that we can really take away from this presentation? Well, number 1 is the free security lifecycle review service. Now, this is a service that we offer through Palo Alto Networks, where effectively we ship you an appropriate sized firewall. We then mirror traffic from your internal network into the firewall such that it can start to build up this rich source of information, such that it can identify what are the traffic flows inside your network, what are the applications in use over your network, and equally so, do we see any threats inside that traffic? Now, this will kick out a series of PDF reports, which you can take to not just IT security professionals inside your organization, but the management as well, to identify that type of traffic, identify potential malicious payloads that we are seeing inside your networks. Your other two options is to start out with a readiness assessment for the DSPT. We'll have a look at what that means in just a minute or two. And equally so, flowing on to if you need any remediation services, if you need any help in going through the questionnaire and perhaps identifying streams of projects which you can start to maintain or obtain compliance with the DSPT. When it comes to the readiness assessment, what I would say there is choose a section of 10 questions to start out with. We've got some examples here on the screen, and equally so, if you'd like these examples, get in touch with Will or your account manager and we can email them over, and see what your compliance is with each of these 10 questions. And if we're not compliant with the large majority of them, perhaps we need to up our game when it comes to obtaining the DSPT certifications, obtaining our Cyber Essentials certifications. But that if we are compliant with the large majority of these, that we are already well along the road. Perhaps we are nearly done to obtaining proper certification or full compliance, as it were. The easiest and most simplest one of these 10 questions perhaps to get compliance with is having auto run disabled. And auto run being a bit of a legacy method for threat actors to obtain some form of persistence or connection inside your network, but still one that's very relevant. One of the great things about disabling auto run is it really is a group policy change that can be pushed out across your entire infrastructure very easily with very little impact on your network. And again, as Will mentioned earlier, some of these can actually be met by other NHS services and tools. For example, if you've got NHS Mail, if you're already using NHS Mail, the notion of have you implemented DKIM, DMARC, and SPF records on your email service, you've already got that through NHS Mail. It's ticked some of those boxes. But in some areas, we see trust consistently falling down, and this is the areas to, of course, focus on. So what is the approach in ensuring patches for critical or high-risk vulnerabilities are applied within 14 days of release? And all too often we see organizations starting out with Windows Update, perhaps then moving on to updates for applications that they make deploy, but forgetting some, or perhaps forgetting to patch their internet-facing infrastructure or even their next-generation firewalls. Now, when it comes to these, if we really are not meeting compliance with this set of 10 questions to start out with, perhaps this is one of the cases where one of our remediation sessions can help out. Now, the four-step process that we use here is starting out with a series of interviews with your appropriate individuals inside your organization and begin some data capture. And there we're working through the questions, looking to find evidence that we are indeed meeting the requirements of the DSPT and recording those as we go. This then moves on to some vulnerability scans and some file download tests. If you've already done the Cyber Essentials accreditation, you'll know about these all too well. And in this environment, we're just looking to prove that services are indeed patched, as you've said, and that malicious files or files that might be easily exploitable are indeed blocked at the network or at the client level. And off the back of those two elements, we then move into the reporting phase, and the reporting phase is delivered with a PDF report and also an Excel document. And those reports will give you the responses that you've provided to us for each of the questions, and also a series of projects that you can spin up internally to meet whichever requirement level you're looking at. And of course, organizations will start out with Cyber Essentials and move on to full compliance with DSPT as their timelines allow. Now, each of those projects also comes with a risk and a complexity score against them. And this then brings us into the remediation phase. So you will be looking to target those high risk, high complexity issues as soon as possible. And perhaps in some situations, you might want to offload elements of those to us as professional services, of course. So that's all from me. And what I'll do now is hand back over to Will for some conclusions.
Thanks very much, James. As always, very informative session. So I'm just going to start off, as we're going to say, just going to wrap up the morning session with a few key points just to take away and digest. So number one, and how we started the session today, unfortunately, as an NHS organisation, you're particularly vulnerable to threat actors who are either financially or more likely these days maliciously motivated. And as we said, these threat actors only need to win once in order to achieve their objective. Do things in your control. So not only understanding the current threat landscape, but focus on the things you can impact in order to reduce the organizational threat risk, because fundamentally, this is what it's all about. NHS Digital, alongside the Department of Health and the Cabinet Office, have seen the impact of WannaCry, and it's great to hear in recent years significant investment has been made. One of the things we didn't mention earlier is that NHS Digital have created the Cybersecurity Operations Centre, which to date has blocked around 21 million items of malicious activity. They also have a fantastic community of about 1,000 members. So if you aren't already involved or aware, please do make sure you stick this on your to-do list. However, you can only benefit from these investments and initiatives if you invest 100% into them. And number one on this list should be building a plan of achievement for the Cyber Essentials Plus, which we mentioned has to be attained by June next year. Similarly, you need to do the same for the DSPT, and it probably makes some sense to build this into a program of works rather than having to rehash or go over old ground again in the future. Just a reminder, the DSP opens next month, so a significant amount of effort is required, so please make sure you're ready and prepared. Hopefully, following James's remarks earlier, you're more clued up about the Secure Boundary Service, which is a great solution that will protect yourselves and NHS organisations from the most sophisticated cyber threats. There is also another initiative which you would probably be aware of in terms of the licensing benefits for upgrading to Windows 10, and a key part of this was the provision of Microsoft's ATP. As you know, this provides endpoint security across connected devices, giving you and NHS Digital a view of the threat status and vulnerabilities. And the best bit about this, again, is completely free of charge. But I suppose with all these initiatives, there's still things out there not be able to protect ourselves from threats such as WannaCry. I know we keep going on about WannaCry, but there's still thousands of other damaging attacks out there that could hit at any one point. You need to build a plan to consider the internal security. As James has highlighted throughout his presentation, what we mean by that is segmentation and segregation. However good the Secure Boundary Service is, it still means you have significant gaps in your internal network, which is your responsibility. So what can you do next? Well, you could come and talk to us. We have experienced cyber experts here, like James and myself, who can help advise, point in the right direction, or just provide good guidance on how to build that next plan. So you can take us up an offer to run a security lifecycle review for you. We have run hundreds of these reviews for trusts over the last couple of years. I can pretty much guarantee these reports will produce a range of interesting aspects and points that you may not have already considered or be aware of in some instances. So we're happy to sit down and translate the documentation into results and a language that you and the business will understand, and then you can action therefore, if you choose to do so. And to add to that, we can also get you ready for Cyber Essentials Plus. We are very proud to announce we have a 100% pass rate with organisations in both the public and private sectors to date, and we can help you to prepare for that assessment. Also, while you're looking at the DSPT, we can also talk to you about that as well. The surefire way of ensuring that you're fully aware of what's going on is to run a full remediation session. As James said, this starts with interviews with stakeholders and then moves on to a range of cognitive testing and vulnerability scans, which then provide you with a comprehensive report of what needs to be done, the reasons why, and most importantly, what happens if you did nothing. So that concludes our prepared content for today's session. I'm glad to say I've had a number of emails come through. So James, do you mind if I run these past yourself for answering?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so let me just have a quick look here. First one we've had is Palo Alto XDR included within the secure boundary service.
Okay, so someone's been doing their reading up there. So the Cortex XDR service is a separate service which is about embedding an agent on the client computer for the purpose of detecting threats. So what you're actually getting is the Cortex data lake with secure boundary. So this is their centralized logging service, but Cortex XDR itself is something separate, which isn't included. That's about protecting the endpoint.
Thank you, James. Another one here. Sorry, squinting my eyes at the screen. Can secure boundary replace my Intersite MPLS?
So the underlying service of secure boundary, Palo Alto Prisma Access, is actually designed to do that. Now, I haven't actually seen any instance of an NHS trust which has used it in that manner yet, but certainly it's something to explore. And yeah, do get in touch and we can explore the options there for it as well.
Okay, a couple more here, James. This sounds great for the edge of my network, but will I still need firewalls for internal segregation or just running a DMZ?
Yeah, so that's what we were kind of talking about there earlier with internal segmentation and segregation. For the longest time, we've effectively seen organizations have 3 firewall zones. So the internet, their DMZ, and then their internal trusted network. And that's been good for a long time, but the reality now is that if a threat actor hops inside one of your endpoint user devices and then wants to compromise a server which isn't inside your DMZ, there's going to be nothing that you can do at the network level to actually detect or stop that. So there is still very much a need for having an internal firewall, having internal segmentation, segregation. I mean, one of the nice things about the secure boundary service, of course, is that you can offload the protection or the effort or the hardware required for protecting traffic going to and from the internet to secure boundary, and then perhaps repurpose your existing firewalls, your existing appliances, and reorientate them towards protecting your internal infrastructure, something which has definitely been kind of out of the cost regions for some organizations for some time now. So yes, definitely.
Fantastic. I just want to try and get a couple of them before our time's up. I have a site with resilient internet connections. Can I build failover tunnels up to secure boundary for this particular site?
Yeah, so again, it's kind of what the Prisma Access service is designed to do, the underlying service for it. There'll be some architectural considerations there. There will be some more complex discussions that we'll have to have offline there to figure out how that's going to work for you in your environment, but it's what the service is designed to do.
Fantastic. And the final one here is quite prevalent with the recent activity we've had today. Can it do remote access /VPN?
Yeah, so there are 2 aspects to the Prisma Access service. So one of them is the service which they're delivering here is Secure Boundary, which is all about protecting your internet connectivity for your sites. There is then the client side of things, the end user device side of things, which isn't included with Secure Boundary, but it can certainly be another service to tack on separately outside of the scope of Secure Boundary.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, that's the questions we've had in. I suppose finally, it's just to wish, thank you very much everyone to joining today. I hope you found it informative. Thank you to James and the questions we've had. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you all. Cheers.
Cheers. Goodbye.